Hey guys, what's up? So today we're going to be covering Meditation 2, and Meditation 2 concerns the nature of the human mind, and that it's generally better known than the body, and Descartes will elaborate on that as we, move on. Okay, so in Meditation 2, Descartes searches for his philosophical Archimedean point, or basically a point that is, indubitable, which is going to lead him to one of the most famous philosophical sayings in history. You probably will guess it, but that's actually in the discourse on method, where he says "cogito ergo sum," but in the meditation he says "I am, I exist." And so the first meditation has left Descartes in a whirlpool of doubt, and now he is unsure how to basically resolve all these doubts, right? And so he continues to search for this point, and Descartes compares this with Archimedes, who searched for one fixed point to move the entire Earth. So then again, it's just a philosophical Archimedean point. And so by finding this philosophical point, Descartes is going to be able to build a certain foundation of knowledge, which is strong, infallible. And Descartes doubts everything, which includes memory, perceptions, and the body. And so, given this very extreme form of skepticism, what really remains, you may ask? Well, maybe the truth that the only truth is that nothing is certain, right? Maybe that's the only thing that's true. And so Descartes also questions whether a God really exists who is instilling thoughts in him, but he asks why assume that maybe he's, the author of his own thoughts, right? And this leads to one of the steps of the cogito, or the cogito. He asks, does he himself exist? He's doubted everything external, but what about himself, his own existence or being? Now Descartes realizes that even if a very evil deceiver exists, the fact that the deceiver deceives Descartes. Sorry, I spelled deceives wrong. I put R instead of deceives. But the fact that the deceiver deceives Descartes proves Descartes' own existence. If he is being deceived, then he must exist in order to be deceived. Even if all thoughts are illusions, this act of thinking itself is infallible and undeniable. So now he has reached his first indubitable truth, as he puts it. I am, I exist, is necessarily true every time I utter it or conceive it in my mind. But now he has established he exists, he also asks, what am I? And so before this meditation, he thought of himself as a man. And so he might as well define man as a rational animal, but you can always ask more like, what does rational even mean? What is animal? What is rationality? Alright, what is animality, right? And he previously conceived of himself as having a body with a face, hands, arms, etc., legs, in which he could do several things like eat, talk, and walk. And so he attributed these bodily functions to the body and kept the mental stuff to the soul. And he previously made a distinction between the soul and the body. He thought that movement, sensation, and thought did not belong to bodily nature. And so he assumes the presence of an evil deceiver who tries to deceive him about everything. Can he still affirm anything about himself? And so he focuses on the bodily attributes he once assumed to be his. And so can he affirm that he has a body? No, right? Because the evil demon can make him perceive that, right? But it's not actually the case. And can he affirm that he nourishes himself or moves? No, because without a body, those concepts would not make any sense. Can he affirm that he has senses? Can he affirm that he senses things? No, because sensation requires a body, but he really doesn't even have one. And he recalls that in dreams, he thought he was sensing, but those sensations were just illusions. However, one thing stands out in everything. One thing remains, which is thinking. Thinking, right? The power of thought. And so he discovers that thought cannot be separated from him. And so the fact that I am, I exist is certain. But for how long will he exist? As long as he is thinking. So if he were to stop thinking, then, bye bye, Mr. Descartes. And so he declares himself as a thinking thing, which means he's a mind, an intellect, an understanding, or reason. He truly exists, but his nature is not what he wants to believe. He is not a body, he is not a soul. He is simply a being that thinks. This also forms the foundation to as what is known as Cartesian dualism, as the mind res cogitans is distinct from the body res extensa. Right? That is what basically Cartesian dualism is. And so the mind's essence is thought, while the body's essence is extension. So even if the body didn't exist, Descartes is still logically going to exist. And so he realizes that um, And actually, there's a funny thing. In the first objections to Descartes, this philosopher mentions John Duns Scotus, and he says that how do you like the body? He mentions his Duns Scotus, his formal distinction, where the body and the mind may not actually they might be distinct, but that doesn't mean they're actually separable, right? And that's basically a formal distinction. And so Descartes realizes that imagining himself as something like a body is an error. Why? Because imagination is merely the contemplation of an image of a corporeal thing. Thus, using imagination to understand the self would just be as foolish as trying to see something more clearly by deliberately going to sleep and dreaming about it. And so Descartes says a thinking thing is, I forgot to put a thinking thing, but it's supposed to be a thinking thing. So Descartes says a thinking thing is doubting, understanding, affirming, denying, willing, refusing, imagining, and sensing. These activities are inseparable from the self. This is essential to the self. And so he argues that the self is necessarily the entity that engages in these activities. Even if he were constantly deceived or dreaming, the act of being deceived implies a subject to his thinking. So even if all sensory experiences are illusions, the fact that they are experienced means there is still a thinker behind them. He says that he sees, hears, and feels warmth even if he is dreaming. Even if external objects do not exist, the sensations themselves exist within him. So this is kind of like a form of foundationalism, right? Foundationalism also believes in direct, immediate perceptions, which are infallible. And so sensing is just another form of thinking, and it does not necessarily prove the existence of external objects. Now, Descartes introduces the wax example. If you remember from the video I made on the wax example, yeah, I basically laid out how Descartes explains it. But he selects a piece of wax as an example of how bodies are understood. The wax has a distinct taste, a smell, a color, shape, and size, a hard and cold texture, and a sound when tapped. But now take the wax and place it near a fire. You're gonna see that the honey's taste disappears, the smell vanishes, the color changes, the shape deforms, the size increases, it becomes hot and liquid, and it loses its ability to produce sound when tapped. And so the sensory qualities that you perceived now have now changed. But despite all these changes, Descartes says that everyone is going to agree that the wax remains. I mean, who denies it? Right? That's what he says. And so he says that, so this proves that the wax is not its sensory property. So what is it? And Descartes says that the wax is a body that manifests itself in different ways over time. He also critiques that if imagination can grasp the nature of the wax, but the wax is capable of infinite variations which he cannot fully imagine. Therefore, the essence or the nature of the wax is not grasped through the imagination. And so thus, since neither senses nor imagination can fully grasp the wax, only the intellect, which is the mind, perceives it or grasps it, right? This also applies to all objects in which they are known by the mind instead of the senses. The senses gives us the appearances, but real knowledge comes from the intellectual perception. Even when the senses present something to us, it is the mind that determines what it truly is. And so Descartes argues that knowledge begins with the self and the mind, rather than the external world. Descartes also critiques how people ordinarily describe their perception of objects, which can be misleading, like when people say, "I see the wax itself," which implies that they know the wax directly through vision. But Descartes realizes that what they actually perceive is not literally the wax itself, but its external qualities such as color and shape. Its accidental qualities, basically. Descartes also shows us the fallibility of the senses through the example of the people in the square. When you look out of a window, one sees people crossing the square. However, what does one actually see? Only hats and clothes, not the people themselves. There is no direct sensory evidence that these figures are actually people, rather than, say, disguised automata. And automata just means machines, by the way. BTW means by the way. It's an acronym. I forgot to capitalize it though. And so the mind strips away the sensory properties which potentially changes and perceives the wax as an extended, flexible, and changeable substance. This deeper understanding could not be done through mere imagination or sensory experience, but only through rational thought or the mind or the intellect. And so the ability to distinguish the wax from its external properties shows a fundamental difference between humans and animals. Even though animals might react to sensory stimuli, only humans can engage in rational inspection to perceive the underlying essence or natures of things, which also implies the superiority of the intellect over the senses. And so the self is also better known than the external world. If his belief in the wax's existence is based on perception, then his own existence is even more certain. Because he is the one, and he, by the way, is I'm referring to Mr. Descartes, because he is the one who is doing the perceiving and thinking, right? If the wax's true nature is not perceived through sight or touch, but through the intellect, then all external objects must also thereby be understood in the same way. This means that bodies are not just perceived through the senses, but rather through the mind's understanding of them. However, the mind itself is even more distinctly known, since it is the foundation of all knowledge. As Descartes is a rationalist, by the way. So this is why he says this. So this is the end of meditation 2. Have a good night, guys, because I recorded this late.